All right, Crim 28, let's knock out chapter 9. Let's see if we can get, there we go. Chapter 9, non-residential graduated sanctions. Again, doesn't that chapter title sound ridiculously exciting? I know. Blah, 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 learning objectives. Okay, so we're going to talk about some things. These are kind of tools and other programs that are used to supervise offenders who are not in custody. So they are not necessarily completely free to live at home as they choose, but they are not necessarily in custody either. One of those programs is house arrest. And I could tell you, working with probation, one of the options that we had for releasing youth, so these are juveniles at least, from custody at juvenile hall, was called supervised home detention, which was basically house arrest. So this was being released from custody with no type of apparatus. They didn't have an electronic monitoring device. They didn't have GPS, a global positioning system. They didn't have any kind of device. What they did was give us our word that they were going to stay home. They signed a little document saying, I promise that I'm going to stay home. Yeah. You know how that goes, right? So you can imagine how fun it was as a probation officer to supervise somebody who was on just house arrest. Unfortunately, in my personal experience, house arrest was not particularly effective. We're talking about people who are alleged to have committed crimes. And maybe I'm being negative Nancy here, but a lot of people who are alleged, not all, but a lot of people who are alleged to have committed crimes, they actually did commit crimes, a lot of them. So you can't necessarily trust that if you tell them to sign a piece of paper and tell them to promise to stay home, that they're actually going to stay home. I know, it's shocking, right? Anyways, so house arrest. There are different kinds of house arrest. I don't know if any of you, and if any of you have had, if you're like looking for something to binge watch, the documentary about Epstein, the guy who was who molested a bunch of the young, really rich guy who molested a bunch of young girls, and then allegedly killed himself in jail while he was pending trial. He was on a house arrest type of program. Very interesting. Anyways, so house arrest. It is an intermediate sanction designed to confine pretrial detainees or convicted offenders to their homes during hours when they are not at work, or attending treatment programs or visiting their supervising officer. Can be used for offenders who cannot make bail, and sometimes for convicted offenders, it's part of their sentence that you're going to, for the first 90 days of your sentence, you are going to be ordered to stay home. Unless you're at school, work, or at appointments with your probation officer or parole agent. So what are the purposes? Basically to keep someone at home. What you're trying to do, and I had to, as a probation officer, again, I was kind of, my supervisor, sometimes I would ask them, like, why are we trying to get these people to stay home? Sometimes their homes were so messed up, we were trying to figure out why we would want to keep them at home. But ultimately, staying home, the goal was to try and get them into a habit of good behavior. So house arrest programs have grown as an alternative to incarceration, and this is not going to shock you why, because having an offender stay home as opposed to locking that offender up saves money, right? It helps with overcrowding, all these types of things that are common sense concepts that I don't need to tell you about. If they are not at work, at school, in their treatment programs, or meeting with their probation officer, they're supposed to be home. If they are not where they're supposed to be at home during a certain time, then they're in violation. Sometimes the probation officer, parole agent, whatever, will call the home to check and make sure the offender is home. Sometimes they'll go out to the home to check and make sure the offender is home. Obviously, without that extra device, like an electronic monitoring device, the ankle monitor or a GPS device, it's pretty tricky to confirm that the offender is actually home. There are a lot of criticisms of house arrest. Again, going back to Warren Epstein. Warren? What the heck's the guy's name? Jeffrey Epstein. There you go, Jeffrey Epstein. A lot of people were really disgusted because this is he was being punished by going home and living in his beautiful mansion in Florida. A lot of people would say that's ridiculous. That's not punishment. Some people who are on this kind of house arrest are complaining that their right to privacy is being violated. If I had the option to be at home and having probation or parole agents coming into my house versus being in jail, that would be a no-brainer to me. Come on in, probation officers and parole agents. As long as I don't have to sleep and live in a jail or prison, they could come in whenever they wanted, but that's just me. Can they still commit crimes at home? Of course they can. Domestic violence, of course, it's very possible that domestic violence incidents can go up because we've all been living in a pandemic where we've all had to live at home day and night for weeks and months on end with each other for the past, 7 or 8 months. Could you imagine? Guaranteed you all have been fighting with your families a little bit more than maybe before because you're all stuck together. It does take a person of real discipline and someone who really wants to change in order to comply with that, with house arrest. So how effective is it? Offenders on house arrest are twice as likely as regular parolees to have their parole revoked. Probably because they're being watched more closely, I will be honest. I don't necessarily think that offenders on house arrest violate more. I think they're being watched more closely. That's my opinion. But they are more likely to have their probation or parole revoked. Failure rates and absconding rates compared with other pretrial programs are similar. And house arrest allows pretrial defendants a chance to work and continue to support their families. So there is a positive to leaving offenders in the home. If they are not, horrible human beings who are torturing and destroying their families, and they are maybe just a person who made a bad choice, sometimes leaving them in the home so that they can work and they can support their own families as opposed to you and I supporting their families and keep those strong relationships with their children and things like that. Those can oftentimes be benefits. Okay, then we have something like an electronic monitoring device. Okay. So this is kind of more of a lower level device. And I can tell you my experience, they have probably modernized these somewhat since I left probation. And I left in 2016. So what an electronic monitoring device is, you've seen the ankle strap and there's a little, a box type thing, maybe... I want to say the size of a pager, but you guys don't know what a pager looks like probably. Not quite the size of a cell phone, maybe the size of those small flip phones that people used to have a long time ago. But anyways, they have a little, like a square rectangle box thing on their ankles. And the strap that holds the electronic monitor on has wires that go through it. And those wires, if you cut through those wires, or if you tamper with those wires, there is the electronic monitoring device sends a tamper report. So anytime someone cuts one of those off, they think that because they haven't damaged the actual box thing that goes on the ankle, but only the strap, they think that they're fine and nobody's going to know. Well, there's sensors inside the actual strap too. So the strap has sensors, and then the box has the device that that basically talks to a box, another box, that hooks up to a home phone line. I know, you guys are like, who the heck in this world has home phone lines? Right, that's why it started to really become a problem, because most people didn't have home phone lines anymore. And this was even, 2016 when I left. So now I would guess that even fewer people have home phone lines. So with electronic monitoring, you had to, number one, have a home phone line. And number two, the little box on the ankle had a relationship with the box that was connected to the home phone. And there was a distance, a range that was set. So you were allowed to go within a certain distance from the box that was connected to your home phone. Let's say it was 100 yards. So as soon as you went more than 100 yards away from your home phone, then an alarm would go off. And your probation officer, parole agent would get an out of range report. Defendant is out of range. Defendant is out of range. The problem there would be that it wouldn't tell you where the defendant was. It would just tell you that the defendant was out of range. Does that make sense? So as soon as you left the area, you were more than 100 yards away, the box would report back and say, your defendant is out of range. Very not helpful, because even though you would tell every defendant, do not go into the backyard, do not go into the front yard, do not walk your daughter to school, do not... Everybody would come back and say, oh, shoot, I forgot. I took the garbage out. I had to walk the dog. I had to, all that kind of stuff. Could I prove that was not out there walking their dog? No, I couldn't. Okay. So that's an electronic monitoring type of device. Here's the history of it. Started in about the 1960s, blah, blah, blah. Spider-Man comics, interesting. Started using those in 1983 for DUI offenders, which I thought was pretty interesting. Early problems, offenders had to have a landline. Discriminating against the poor, this is another problem. When I worked in the juvenile courts, we had issues with some people didn't have phones. And honestly, it was really expensive to get a home phone line, which is, I don't know why it was so ridiculous, but it was. Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, once they left, people didn't, it wouldn't tell you where they were. Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so these are some issues with early problems with electronic monitoring. Then GPS. GPS is much more reliable, of course. And I'm guessing that you all know GPS, Global Positioning System. Very similar device on the ankle. When I left probation in 2016, this device was bigger than the electronic monitoring thing. So that the ankle transmitter was a little bit bigger. But we could see where the person was in real time all day, every day. So this was a lot more helpful. These are used really commonly for homeless sex offenders. Homeless sex offenders. Yes, there are tons of homeless sex offenders. Scary thought, right? Permanent ankle bracelet. And again, if they try to do anything with the ankle bracelet, a tamper report comes through. Now, can they cut this ankle bracelet off? Yes. Can they throw it on the ground somewhere and take off? Yes. It can happen, and it does happen. But typically, the officer is going to be advised, hey, this is the date and time that they cut it off, and here's where it is. So hopefully they'll get the opportunity to know at least where the offender last was. Active GPS works like a cell phone. So if you're if you're a parent like me and you stalk your kids on Find My iPhone or any of those other things, it's basically the same type of deal. Blah, blah, blah. Then there are, you can set up certain zones where the offender is allowed to go and or where the offender is not allowed to go, exclusion zones or inclusion zones. Now, if you've got a sex offender, you're going to put any school area, any area that's within a certain distance of a school is going to be an exclusion zone. And anytime a sex offender gets near or goes into an area that is an exclusion zone, you're going to get an alert. Inclusion zone is where the offender should be. Tampers, anyways, anytime the offender does something they're not supposed to do, the officer should receive an alert. These are different types of GPS risk levels and electronic monitoring. If it's a low risk offender, regular old electronic monitoring is probably not that unreasonable. But when you have a medium or high risk offender, especially for a high risk offender, you want that active GPS and you want to know every 2 to 3 minutes where that offender is, especially when you're talking about something like a high risk homeless sex offender. A lot of you are asking, why would a high-risk homeless sex offender be out of custody anyway? Trust me, there are a lot of high-risk homeless sex offenders living on our streets right now. Are there limitations? Of course there are. Battery lives. This is one of the things. If you're homeless, how the heck are you going to charge your battery? Those batteries have to be charged. They aren't magic. They don't live forever. They can remove the device. I mean, I've seen people cut their devices off with scissors. I mean, if they want to get them off, they can get them off. The cost is very expensive, GPS, and sometimes they lose signals. Just like when your cell phone loses signal or you're in a dead spot. So there's all kinds of limitations as well. And again, think high-risk sex offender. Are these issues you want to come up with when you have a high-risk sex offender? How do people feel about him? You know, I think there's probably a lot of mixed feelings. Courts have found that they are constitutional. So there's a mixed bag of the way people feel about him. Empirical evaluations, how well do they work? A lot of people will say, how long is reasonable to keep someone on GPS and or electronic monitoring? And I'll tell you, with juveniles, what they typically do is about 90 days. That's about as long as they'll go with juveniles. Adults, about 6 months. And basically, people start to really burn out after that period of time and then just say, screw it, I'm going to do whatever I want. So that's what they're talking about here with that threshold. And what they're really trying to do is build a habit here. So a comparison of EM offenders basically found similar recidivism rates with those that were on regular supervision as opposed to electronic monitoring. About the same with GPS parolees as opposed to traditional parolees. So is it effective? I don't know. Kind of hard to say. You're talking about pretty high risk offenders here. So tough call. Gender differences. Women really support their men when their men are on electronic monitoring, but the men try and stress out their women and make them violate. I'm kind of reading into this. Anyways, electronic monitoring and GPS hold promise as technology improves, but success depends on using it with the correct offenders. And do probation officers, parole agents rely too much on technology? Do we have unrealistic expectations that that GPS device is actually working? Some of you have probably heard stories from people saying, I took it off and I I put it on my dog. I've heard that before. So, yeah, who knows? Anyways, so that was, I forgot day reporting centers. Okay, we've talked a little bit about these before, I think, but we have a day reporting center program in Fresno. It is over by the airport. I think it's on, is it on Winery? I think it's out on Winery, near the airport. This is ultimately a program where offenders go there from 8 to 5, Monday through Friday, and they receive substance abuse. They receive basically treatment and services there all day. And basically, it's designed to keep them out of trouble by making sure they're supervised Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, and they're receiving all the services they're supposed to need. So they get drug treatment. They receive vocational services. They'll do resumes with them. They'll do anger management, batters treatment. They'll meet with their probation officers. They'll do drug testing, all that kind of stuff. It is that whole idea of a one-stop shop. And then they go home at night and they come back in the morning, Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. They go to this day reporting center program in lieu of or instead of being in custody. So this is kind of a new push. It's a lot cheaper than keeping them locked up, but it is a more intensive type of program. And they call them DRCs, Day Reporting Center. Started about the 1970s. We've had one here in Fresno for at least 10, 15 years. I would say at least 15 years. And we have one for adults. We have one for juveniles as well. Kind of talks about the history, Massachusetts, Connecticut. I think ours in Fresno is pretty big. I have been there on a few occasions. One for juveniles is pretty big. Some of them emphasize treatment. Some of them emphasize supervision. I think we focus on both here in Fresno because we do have a lot of probation officers assigned out there for the supervision aspect, but we also have mental health and substance abuse programs out there as well to work with the offenders. Plus, we have the vocational component out there so we can try and get our offenders employed. Wide range of services, classes, counseling, all that kind of stuff. Typically, the offenders are out there for about 6 months. It is more costly than traditional supervision, but it sure as heck costs a lot less than incarceration. How do they work? Are they effective? It's tough to say because a lot of these are fairly high-risk offenders. So they have not been found to be particularly effective. But we are still working with these. So I think that's it. Chapter 9, done.